Queen Lyra of the Astralese Empire gazed through the observatory dome of her palace, watching the unfamiliar ship descend through crimson clouds. The vessel, human in design, lacked the elegant biomechanical symmetry of Astralese crafts, appearing instead as an ungainly collection of angles and thrusters. "Their technology is primitive," she observed, her voice as measured and cold as the calculations running through her mind. "Yet they've somehow mastered faster-than-light travel." Admiral Vex, her most trusted advisor, stood at attention beside her throne. "Humans are unpredictable, Your Majesty. Our intelligence suggests they compensate for technological deficiencies with remarkable adaptability." Lyra's silver eyes narrowed. In 3 centuries of rule, she had annexed 17 planetary systems, each conquest executed with mathematical precision. The Astralese philosophy was simple: emotion led to inefficiency, inefficiency led to extinction. Her species had evolved beyond such weaknesses, their crystalline biology mirroring their approach to civilization: structured, transparent, and unyielding. "Adaptability without direction is merely chaos," she replied, rising to her full height of nearly 7 feet. Her translucent skin shimmered with bioluminescent patterns that reflected her status, intricate fractals that no subject dared meet with direct gaze. "Prepare the diplomatic chamber. I will assess these humans myself." The human delegation consisted of 5 individuals, but Lyra's attention immediately fixed on their leader. Dr. Marcus Rivera lacked the physical imposingness her culture valued: average height, with warm brown skin and eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Most disturbing was how frequently he did smile. "Queen Lyra," he said, bowing at precisely the angle her cultural attachés must have instructed. "On behalf of the United Earth Coalition, I bring greetings and hopes for mutual understanding." Lyra inclined her head a calculated degree. "The Astralese Empire acknowledges Earth. You may present your credentials." Rather than proceeding with formal protocols, Marcus stepped forward, producing a small object from his pocket. "Before official business, I'd like to offer a personal gift." Admiral Vex stiffened beside the throne. Unscheduled gestures were not permitted in royal audiences. "It's a tradition among my people," Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to the tension rippling through the crystalline guards. "When meeting new friends." "Friends?" Lyra repeated the word as though testing an unfamiliar chemical compound. "You presume much, Dr. Rivera." "Hope isn't presumption, Your Majesty," he replied without hesitation. "It's possibility." He opened his palm, revealing a small terrarium containing an earth flower, deep blue with a golden center, surviving in its self-contained environment. "A forget-me-not," he explained. "It thrives in difficult conditions. I thought it might interest your botanical scientists." Lyra studied the gift, then Marcus himself. Most species approached the Astralese with either fear or strategic flattery. This human offered a plant. Inefficient. Irrational. Yet she found herself accepting the terrarium, watching how light refracted through its glass to cast rainbow patterns across her throne. "You will be assigned quarters," she announced abruptly. "Tomorrow, you will meet with Science Minister Thorne to discuss knowledge exchange parameters." Marcus nodded, that unsettling smile returning. "I look forward to learning about your people, Queen Lyra." After the humans departed, Admiral Vex approached cautiously. "Your strategy, Majesty?" Lyra placed the terrarium beside her throne, watching the tiny plant sway in its enclosed atmosphere. "Humans possess resources we require. Study their weaknesses. Analyze their emotional patterns." She didn't mention how the human's direct gaze had disturbed her internal equilibrium. Such an admission would be inefficient. And Dr. Rivera specifically? Lyra's bioluminescent patterns pulsed once, the only outward sign of her uncertainty. A variable requiring further observation. That night, in her private chambers, Lyra found herself returning to the terrarium. The forget-me-not seemed to glow in the dim light, its simple existence a contradiction to everything the Astralise valued. Her people had engineered their world to eliminate biological unpredictability. Their architecture was grown, not built, crystalline structures that responded to thought and purpose. The flower, by contrast, served no function beyond its own survival. Inefficient. Purposeless. Yet she couldn't stop examining it. "Computer, analyze Earth botanical specimen," she commanded. Analysis complete, the Palace AI responded. Specimen contains unusual cellular structures capable of emotional response to sound vibrations and touch stimuli. Lyra's fingers hovered over the glass. Clarify. Plants do not experience emotions. Earth flora operates on different biological principles, Your Majesty. This specimen displays measurable reactions consistent with what humans categorize as contentment when exposed to certain frequencies. The Queen withdrew her hand. The idea was absurd, a plant experiencing contentment? The humans were obviously projecting their emotional weaknesses onto simple organisms. Yet as she prepared for sleep, Lyra found herself issuing one final command: play Earth botanical research frequencies. Soft sounds filled her chamber, what humans called music. As she drifted into resting state, the Queen of the Astralise Empire watched the tiny blue flower seem to turn toward the sound. A troubling thought formed in her perfectly ordered mind: what if complexity wasn't always inefficient? What if the human's chaotic adaptability contained patterns she had yet to recognize? "Computer, schedule additional observation periods for Dr. Marcus Rivera," she murmured. Priority level, Royal Inquiry. Tomorrow would bring more data. Tomorrow, she would understand this disruption to her carefully calculated existence. Science Minister Thorne's laboratory spanned 3 crystalline levels of the palace's eastern wing. Unlike the austere throne room, here the Astralise aesthetic allowed for a controlled form of chaos, specimens from conquered worlds preserved in luminous stasis fields, complex equations streaming across transparent displays, and the gentle hum of quantum computers processing data. "Your civilization's medical advances are particularly intriguing," Thorne said, her translucent fingers manipulating a holographic display of human DNA. "Primitive, yet occasionally innovative." Dr. Marcus Rivera showed none of the offense most species would take at such assessment. Instead, he leaned forward with genuine interest. "We've had to be creative. Without your crystalline biology, we've relied on mechanical and biochemical solutions." Queen Lyra observed from an elevated platform, ostensibly reviewing interstellar reports but actually studying the humans' reactions. 5 days of diplomatic exchanges had yielded unexpected data. The human delegation performed their duties adequately, but Dr. Rivera himself continued to deviate from predictable patterns. "You seem to value innovation born from limitation," she noted, descending to join them. The laboratory staff immediately straightened, their bioluminescent patterns dimming in deference. "Necessity mother's invention, Your Majesty," Marcus replied with that persistent smile. "Constraints force us to see possibilities we might otherwise miss. An inefficient approach. The Astralise identify problems and eliminate them systematically." "And yet," Marcus said, gesturing to a failed experiment display, "even your scientists encounter unexpected outcomes." Thorne's patterns flashed warning colors. Temporary setbacks in pursuit of perfection. Marcus's expression softened. "In human science, we often learn more from our failures than our successes." Lyra found herself studying the failed experiment, a crystalline growth that had developed irregular patterns instead of the symmetrical structure intended. By Astralise standards, it was flawed, designated for dissolution and recycling. "You would preserve this imperfection?" she asked. "I would study it," Marcus corrected gently. "Sometimes what looks like a flaw is actually a new adaptation." The Queen's eyes narrowed. "Minister Thorne, continue the knowledge exchange." I require Dr. Rivera's presence for a diplomatic matter. As they walked through the palace corridors, Lyra noted how the human observed everything with unmasked curiosity rather than the calculated assessment an astrolese would employ. Your people approach knowledge differently than mine, she stated as they entered the royal gardens, geometric arrangements of crystal flora that responded to light and sound with mathematical precision. How so? Marcus asked, bending to examine a spiral pattern growth. You seek information without clear purpose. Inefficient. He straightened, meeting her gaze directly, a protocol violation she inexplicably allowed. Knowledge doesn't always reveal its purpose immediately. Sometimes understanding comes later. A luxury of species with short lifespans, Lyra replied. The astrolese plan in centuries, not decades. Marcus considered this, then pointed to a crystal formation that had grown beyond its designated boundaries. Yet even your gardens have rebels. Before she could respond, a commotion erupted at the garden's entrance. A small astrolese child, no more than 30 years old, barely reaching Lyra's waist, had evaded the royal guards and was racing through the precisely arranged crystal beds, disrupting their harmony. The queen's patterns flashed with disapproval. Children were rarely permitted in the royal sector, their unpredictable nature deemed disruptive to efficient governance. Restrain the child, she commanded the approaching guards. But Marcus was already moving, kneeling as the young astrolese stumbled to a halt before him, trembling with bioluminescent fear patterns. Hello there, he said gently. These gardens are beautiful, aren't they? The child's patterns stabilized slightly. I wanted to see the sky flowers. My creator told me about them. Marcus glanced at Lyra, a question in his eyes. Crystal formations that respond to atmospheric conditions, she explained stiffly. Restricted to royal observation. Perhaps, Marcus suggested, the queen might make an exception. Scientific curiosity should be encouraged, shouldn't it? The guards had surrounded them now, awaiting orders. The child's fear patterns intensified. Lyra found herself in an unexpected decision matrix. Protocol demanded the child be removed and disciplined. Efficiency demanded adherence to established restrictions. Yet the human's words created an alternative pathway in her thinking. Child, identify your designation and creator, she commanded. Pixel, daughter of Engineer Lumen, Your Majesty, the small voice replied. Engineer Lumen designs our atmospheric regulators, Lyra noted with surprise. A critical function. The fear in the child's patterns gave way to pride. I want to design sky gardens when I'm grown. All over the city, so everyone can see them. Marcus smiled. A worthy ambition. Lyra studied the child, then made an unprecedented decision. Guards, escort Pixel to the Western Observatory. She may observe the sky flowers for precisely 15 minutes. The child's patterns exploded with joy light, a display so bright that Lyra actually stepped back. Thank you, Queen. As the guards led Pixel away, Marcus turned to Lyra with an expression she couldn't interpret. That was kind, he said simply. It was logical, she corrected. Engineer Lumen's function is essential to the Empire. Her offspring's scientific development serves imperial interests. Of course, Marcus replied, but his smile suggested he perceived something Lyra hadn't intended to communicate. Later, reviewing the day's events in her private chambers, Lyra found herself troubled by inconsistencies in her own behavior. The forget-me-not continued to thrive in its terrarium, now placed on her personal console rather than relegated to scientific study. Computer, analyze behavioral anomalies in royal decision-making today. Analysis complete, the AI responded. Decision regarding astrolese juvenile Pixel deviated from established protocols by 64%. Potential influences, human diplomatic pressure, productivity optimization for future workforce, or emotional response. Emotional response? Lyra's patterns flickered with indignation. The Astralies do not make decisions based on emotional variables. Correction noted, Your Majesty, the AI responded smoothly. Alternative analysis, strategic adaptation to human cultural expectations. Lyra accepted this explanation, though something in her perfectly ordered mind questioned its accuracy. Tomorrow's diplomatic schedule included a tour of the capital city. Perhaps further observation of Dr. Rivera would clarify these anomalies. She touched the terrarium gently. Computer, play Earth botanical research frequencies. As the music filled her chamber, Lyra found herself wondering what other unexpected adaptations might emerge from this human contact. The royal transport glided silently above Crystallis, the capital city of the Astralis homeworld. Below, geometric structures rose in perfect harmony, their crystalline surfaces refracting the amber light of the binary stars. To Astralis eyes, it was the epitome of order and efficiency. To the human delegation, it appeared eerily lifeless. Your architecture is remarkable, Dr. Marcus Rivera said, his face close to the viewport. But where are your people? Queen Lyra regarded him with cool assessment. Astralis citizens remain in designated sectors during productive hours. Public gathering is inefficient except during synchronized rest periods. So no one just wanders? Explores? Meets by chance? Chance is a primitive concept, Lyra replied. Our society operates on purpose, not probability. Marcus turned from the view, his expression thoughtful. On Earth, some of our greatest discoveries happened by chance. People from different disciplines bumping into each other, sharing ideas. Admiral Vex, who had accompanied them on the tour, interjected. A chaotic approach that explains humanity's limited progress. Rather than taking offense, Marcus smiled. Perhaps. Yet here we are, among the stars. The transport banked smoothly toward the science district, where experimental energy facilities powered the Empire's expansion. Lyra had specifically selected this route to demonstrate Astralis' technological superiority. Without warning, alarms blared through the transport. The pilot's patterns flashed emergency signals. Quantum core instability detected in Facility 7, the pilot reported. Evacuation in progress. Lyra's mind processed the implications instantly. Redirect to safe distance. Alert emergency response teams. The viewport display showed a distant crystalline structure beginning to pulse with unstable energy. Even at this distance, the quantum fluctuations were visible as ripples in the air. How many personnel in the facility? Marcus asked, his casual demeanor suddenly replaced by focused intensity. 47 scientists and support staff, Admiral Vex answered. Already being transported to safety. Marcus leaned forward, studying the display with narrowed eyes. What about that adjacent building? The low structure with the curved roof? Vex and Lyra exchanged glances. The Juvenile Education Center, Lyra said. It should be evacuating now. Marcus pointed to movement visible on the ground. Those are children. They're still there. The pilot enhanced the image. Dozens of small Astralis forms were indeed visible, being led by adults toward evacuation transports. But the facility's pulsing had intensified, creating visible distortion fields that rippled toward the education center. The quantum barrier is failing, Vex noted with clinical detachment. Casualties are now statistically probable. Before anyone could respond, Marcus had moved to the transport's exit hatch. What are you doing? Lyra demanded. Those evacuation transports won't load fast enough, he said, checking the emergency supply compartment and extracting a protective field generator. The distortion will reach them before they're clear. You cannot interfere, Lyra stated. Our emergency protocols are precise. Marcus met her gaze directly. Your protocols didn't account for this kind of quantum core failure. I've seen something similar on our colony worlds. The risk is unacceptable, Vex insisted. You would likely be killed. Maybe, Marcus acknowledged. But I'd rather die trying than watch children die when I might have helped. Without waiting for permission, he activated the hatch. The force of his conviction, his willingness to risk everything for strangers, created a peculiar disturbance in Lyra's thought patterns. Land the transport, she commanded suddenly. Vex's patterns flashed with shock. Your Majesty. Immediately. As the transport descended, Marcus prepared the field generator. I need to establish a temporary barrier between the facility and the education center. It won't hold long, but it might buy enough time to complete the evacuation. I will assist, Lyra announced, rising from her seat. Both Marcus and Vex stared at her in astonishment. The Queens of Astralise do not engage in emergency responses, Vex protested. Your safety is paramount to the Empire. I understand quantum mechanics better than any human, Lyra stated flatly. Logical efficiency demands my participation. The transport landed, and Marcus didn't waste time arguing. They rushed toward the scene, where Astralise children were being loaded into evacuation vehicles. The distortion waves were visibly approaching, causing the air to ripple and crystalline structures to vibrate dangerously. There, Marcus pointed to an optimal position between the failing facility and the education center. Working with unexpected synchronicity, they established the field generator. Lyra's knowledge of quantum physics allowed her to calibrate it precisely to the specific frequency of the distortion waves. It's not strong enough, Marcus observed as the first waves hit the barrier, causing it to flicker ominously. It requires amplification, Lyra agreed. Without hesitation, she placed her hands on the generator, channeling her biocrystalline energy into the device. Her patterns flared brilliantly as her body conducted and transformed the energy. Marcus stared in amazement. You're using yourself as a conduit? A calculated risk, she replied through gritted teeth. The barrier strengthened, glowing with the same patterns that coursed through Lyra's form. The distortion waves crashed against it like a storm against cliffs, but it held. Behind them, the last of the children were loaded into transports that quickly rose into the sky. Only when they were safely distant did Lyra release her connection to the generator, staggering slightly. Marcus caught her arm to steady her, the first time any being had touched the Queen in centuries. The contact sent unfamiliar sensations through her crystalline nervous system. You saved them, he said quietly. We saved them, she corrected, withdrawing from his touch. A logical cooperation of complementary skills. Before he could respond, a massive surge erupted from the facility. The barrier collapsed, and the wave of energy rushed toward them. Acting on instinct, Marcus threw himself in front of Lyra as the distortion hit. Hours later, in the palace medical chamber, Lyra stood over Marcus's unconscious form. Human medical specialists worked alongside Astralise healers, their disparate approaches finding unexpected harmony in crisis. He will recover, the human doctor reported. Though he'll have some interesting scars from the quantum exposure. Why did he do it? Lyra asked, more to herself than anyone present. The doctor glanced up. Do what, Your Majesty? Shield me. It was statistically improbable that his organic body could protect my crystalline form. Humans don't calculate survival odds in emergencies, the doctor replied with a small smile. We just act to protect those we care about. Lyra's patterns shifted in confusion. Dr. Rivera has known me for 8 days. Insufficient time to develop care. The doctor checked Marcus's vital signs before responding. Some humans are just built that way. Marcus sees the potential in everyone, even when they don't see it themselves. After the medical team departed, Lyra remained beside the unconscious human. The events of the day had created unprecedented disruptions in her thought patterns. She had risked herself for Astralise children, logical, perhaps, as they represented the Empire's future. But why had this human risked everything for her? More troubling still, why did the thought of his potential death create such dissonance in her perfectly ordered mind? Inefficient, she murmured, watching his chest rise and fall with breath. Completely inefficient. Yet she remained at his side until dawn. The High Council chamber of the Astralese Empire had remained unchanged for millennia, a perfect dodecahedron of living crystal that amplified and focused the collective consciousness of the 12 most senior advisors. For generations, they had guided the Empire's expansion with cold logic and perfect efficiency. Today, something was different. Your Majesty, Elder Krwx began, his ancient form barely containing his luminescence, the protocol modifications you've proposed are unprecedented. Queen Lyra stood at the center of the chamber, her royal patterns pulsing with unwavering authority. 2 weeks had passed since the quantum facility incident, and she had spent that time in intense analysis and reflection. The data is conclusive, she replied. Our current social segregation protocols limit innovation by 42%. The human delegation has demonstrated that controlled interaction between different knowledge disciplines creates exponential growth in discovery potential. A temporary statistical anomaly, Minister Thorne argued. Human chaotic tendencies occasionally produce useful outcomes, but at the cost of consistent progress. Lyra projected a series of complex equations onto the chamber walls, mathematical proof of her assertions. I have analyzed 500 years of Astralese scientific advancement against 800 years of human progress, adjusted for population and resource differentials. The conclusion is irrefutable: their chaotic approach creates breakthrough innovations at 1.8 times our rate in crisis situations. The Council's collective patterns flickered with discomfort. Admiral Vex, who had witnessed the Queen's behavior during the quantum crisis, leaned forward. Your Majesty, your recent proximity to the human delegation, particularly Dr. Rivera, appears to have influenced your analytical framework. Lyra's patterns pulsed once, a warning. Are you suggesting my logic is compromised, Admiral? I suggest only that different perspectives have value, Vex replied carefully. Including the perspective that perhaps our empire has reached the limitations of our current approach. The chamber fell silent. Never in recorded history had the High Council entertained fundamental changes to the Astralese social structure. Dr. Rivera's recovery progresses well, Lyra stated, changing the subject with deliberate precision. His insights into quantum stabilization have already been implemented in our facilities. Elder Krwx's patterns displayed skepticism. A human understanding our quantum technology seems improbable. He doesn't understand it as we do, Lyra explained. He approaches it from an entirely different framework, one that revealed blind spots in our own thinking. The Queen moved to the Council chamber's viewport, gazing out at the crystalline city below. For the first time, she saw it as Marcus might, beautiful but sterile, perfect but static. I propose a 3-month experimental implementation of controlled cross-disciplinary interaction in the Science District, she continued. With particular focus on juvenile education methodology. Before the Council could respond, a royal guard entered, a serious breach of protocol that caused immediate tension. Your Majesty, the guard announced, patterns flashing urgent codes, we've detected unauthorized access to the quantum communication network. Multiple data streams have been compromised. Lyra's mind shifted instantly to tactical assessment. Origin? Internal, Your Majesty. The Purity faction appears responsible. The Council erupted in agitated patterns. The Purity faction, a small but growing movement within Astralese society, advocated for complete isolation from other species, viewing any external influence as contamination of their perfect crystalline nature. What systems are affected? Vex demanded. Palace security, diplomatic protocols, and... The guard hesitated, the medical wing where the humans are housed. Lyra moved with unprecedented speed. Secure the council. Implement isolation protocols for critical systems. As she strode from the chamber, Elder Krwx called after her, "Your Majesty, protocol dictates you remain under protection during security breaches." Lyra didn't slow her pace. Noted and overridden. The corridors of the palace blurred as she moved with single-minded purpose, royal guards struggling to keep pace. Her mind calculated probabilities, threat scenarios, response strategies, yet beneath these logical processes, something else drove her forward. Something new and undefined that had taken root since Marcus had shielded her body with his own. The medical wing doors slid open to reveal chaos. 2 human security officers lay unconscious, while 3 astralies in the distinctive obsidian patterns of the Purity faction worked at the medical systems. "Step away," Lyra commanded, her voice carrying the full authority of 3 centuries of rule. The infiltrators turned, their patterns showing momentary shock at the Queen's presence. The leader, a scientist Lyra recognized from the weapons division, recovered quickly. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with mocking precision, "we act in the Empire's true interest. This human contamination must be purged." "Your definition of true interest lacks adequate data," Lyra replied coldly. Behind the infiltrators, she could see Marcus on the medical platform, his vital signs fluctuating as they manipulated the support systems. The sight created a disturbing disruption in her thought patterns. "The human's influence has compromised you," the leader stated. "Your recent behavior confirms our assessment. The Purity faction will preserve the Astralese way." "By assassination?" Lyra's patterns flared with unprecedented intensity. "Inefficient. Illogical. And ultimately futile." With a subtle gesture, she activated her royal override, freezing the medical chamber's systems. The infiltrators realized too late that they were trapped. "You've miscalculated," she informed them as royal guards flooded the room. "Dr. Rivera's presence has not compromised our empire, it has revealed opportunities for advancement." As the Purity faction members were detained, Lyra moved to Marcus's side. His condition had stabilized, but the infiltrators had nearly succeeded in introducing toxins into his system. Why go to such lengths, she wondered aloud. One human diplomat hardly threatens an empire spanning 17 systems. Unless, came a weak voice from the platform, that diplomat is making the Queen question things. Lyra looked down to find Marcus conscious, his eyes focusing with effort. "Your security could use some work," he added with a hint of his usual smile. "You were targeted specifically," she told him. "The Purity faction believes your influence threatens Astralese stability." "Does it?" he asked, watching her closely. Lyra considered the question with uncharacteristic hesitation. "You have introduced variables into my analytical framework. Is that your way of saying I've changed how you think?" "Perhaps." She adjusted his medical support systems with careful precision. "The High Council is concerned." "And you?" Marcus asked, his voice stronger. "Are you concerned about these changes?" Lyra's patterns shifted through complex sequences as she processed the question. The logical response would acknowledge potential disruption to efficient governance. Yet she found herself unwilling to frame the changes in negative terms. "I am curious," she admitted finally. "These new thought patterns create unpredicted outcomes." Marcus smiled fully now. "That's the thing about emotions, Your Majesty. They don't follow predictable rules." "I did not mention emotions," she corrected quickly. "Didn't you?" He reached out tentatively, his fingers stopping just short of her crystalline hand. "When you raced here instead of following security protocols? When you confronted armed infiltrators personally?" Lyra stared at his outstretched hand, then at his face. In his expression, she saw something that had been missing from her existence for centuries, genuine connection, unmediated by hierarchy or protocol. After a moment's hesitation that contained 300 years of certainty, Queen Lyra of the Astralese Empire did something unprecedented. She reached out and took his hand. Perhaps, she acknowledged softly, her patterns shifting to colors no Astralese had ever displayed in the recorded history of their species, we should expand our definition of efficiency. The grand ceremonial hall of the Astralese Empire shimmered with living light. Crystal formations that had grown over millennia pulsed in harmonic resonance, their patterns reflecting the collective consciousness of the gathered elite. Today marked the formal signing of the first true alliance between the Astralese Empire and the United Earth Coalition, not a conquest or subjugation, but a partnership of equals. Queen Lyra stood before her crystalline throne, surveying the assembled dignitaries. Her royal patterns had subtly changed over the past month, still regal and commanding, but with new harmonics that the oldest Astralese recognized from ancient times before emotion had been deemed inefficient. A historic moment, Your Majesty, Admiral Vex observed, his own patterns showing cautious approval. Though not without controversy. Lyra acknowledged this with a slight pulse of her luminescence. The Purity faction's failed assassination attempt had exposed deeper divisions within Astralese society than she had previously calculated. Change, it seemed, created resistance even in a culture dedicated to perfect logic. Progress requires adaptation, she replied. Even stars evolve or die, Admiral. Her gaze found Dr. Marcus Rivera among the human delegation. He had fully recovered from both the quantum surge and the assassination attempt, though faint silvery lines now traced his skin where the energy had marked him. Among the Astralese, such patterns were considered signs of distinction, living records of survival and adaptation. The ceremonial chimes resonated through the hall, signaling the start of the proceedings. Lyra stepped forward, her movements deliberate and measured as protocol demanded. The Astralese Empire acknowledges the United Earth Coalition as equals under the stars, she began, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. Today we forge connections that will benefit both our civilizations through knowledge exchange, resource sharing, and mutual defense. As she spoke the formal words, Lyra was acutely aware of the changes within herself. The cold, perfect clarity that had defined her 3-century rule had not diminished, but rather expanded to include new dimensions of understanding. It was as though she had been perceiving reality through a narrow spectrum and now could see colors previously invisible. Marcus stepped forward to represent Earth, bowing with perfect protocol that somehow still maintained his essential humanity. The United Earth Coalition honors this historic alliance. Together, our civilizations will reach heights neither could achieve alone. The treaty interface materialized between them, a crystalline structure that would record their agreement at the quantum level, unchangeable and eternal. As they both reached toward it, the air above them suddenly rippled with distortion. Lyra's tactical awareness instantly recognized the pattern, quantum phase disruption, similar to the facility accident but precisely controlled. Before she could react, 3 figures materialized in the hall, their obsidian patterns identifying them as Purity faction extremists. The Queen is compromised, the leader shouted. The Empire must be purified. Energy weapons discharged, targeting both Lyra and Marcus simultaneously. Time seemed to slow as Lyra's enhanced perception calculated trajectories and outcomes. With crystalline precision, she projected a defensive barrier around Marcus, but left herself exposed. A calculated risk. His survival was necessary for the alliance, her succession was already arranged if she fell. The energy blast struck her midsection, fracturing her crystalline form. Pain, a sensation she had not experienced in centuries, radiated through her being. She heard shouting, saw royal guards converging, felt herself falling. And then Marcus was there, catching her despite the danger, his hands glowing where they touched her fractured form. Lyra, he called, protocol forgotten in crisis. Stay with me. The extremists were quickly subdued, but the damage was done. The Queen's patterns flickered erratically as her self-repair systems struggled to contain the fracturing. "Medical team," someone shouted. "No time," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos. His hands remained on her crystalline form, and Lyra realized with shock that he was somehow stabilizing her at the quantum level, an impossible feat for a human. "How are you?" she began. "The quantum surge changed me," he explained quickly. "Your healer said it was just scars, but it's more than that. I can feel the energy patterns now." The royal guards hesitated, uncertain how to respond to this unprecedented situation. Lyra made the decision for them. "Allow him to continue," she commanded, her voice weakened but still authoritative. Marcus closed his eyes, concentrating. Where his hands touched her fractured crystal, his skin glowed with the same patterns that marked his exposure. Somehow, impossibly, he was channeling his own bioelectrical energy into her crystalline matrix, creating a bridge between two fundamentally different life forms. "This isn't a permanent solution," he told her, strain evident in his voice. "But it will stabilize you until your healers can work." Lyra's analytical mind raced even as her physical form stabilized. The quantum exposure had changed Marcus at the cellular level, creating a unique hybrid resonance that could interact with Astralee's crystalline biology. An adaptation neither species had foreseen, born from chaos, crisis, and connection. As the medical team arrived, Marcus reluctantly withdrew his hands. The fracturing had stopped, though Lyra's form remained damaged. "Why?" she asked him quietly as the healer surrounded her. "You risked yourself. Again. Inefficient." Marcus smiled through his exhaustion. "Some things matter more than efficiency, Lyra." 3 days later, Queen Lyra stood alone in her observatory, her form mostly healed though still bearing fracture lines that would never fully disappear. Like Marcus's scars, they were now part of her, visible reminders of change and adaptation. The door slid open, admitting Marcus without the usual announcement protocol. Another change she had implemented, among many. "The alliance treaty has been ratified by both governments," he reported. "Even after the assassination attempt, your council voted unanimously in favor." "Not unanimity but adaptation," Lyra corrected. "They recognized the changing stellar winds." Marcus joined her at the viewport, where the binary stars of the Astralee system painted the crystalline city in amber and gold. "Your people are talking more in the public spaces. I saw children playing in the central plaza yesterday." "Inefficient, but beautiful." "Beauty has its own efficiency," Lyra replied, surprising herself with the observation. "It creates possibilities." "Speaking of possibilities," Marcus said, turning to face her. "My assignment here was originally scheduled for 6 months. Under the circumstances, Earth has offered to extend it indefinitely." Lyra's patterns shifted through complex harmonics. "And you? What do you calculate is the optimal decision?" "I don't calculate," he replied with a smile. "I feel. And I feel I should stay." The Queen of the Astralease Empire studied him, this human who had disrupted her perfect order and shown her new constellations of possibility. Logic dictated she maintain professional distance to ensure unbiased governance. Efficiency recommended limiting emotional entanglements that might cloud judgment. Yet as she considered these factors, Lyra recognized them as incomplete datasets, frameworks that excluded vital variables she had only recently begun to understand. "The forget-me-not," she said suddenly. "It still thrives in my quarters." Marcus tilted his head, curious at the apparent non-sequitur. "I'm glad to hear it. At first, I considered it inefficient, a life form that exists without clear purpose beyond its own survival and propagation." She turned fully to face him. "Now I understand it exists to remind us that life finds ways to thrive even in unlikely environments. That beauty and resilience are their own forms of purpose." With deliberate movement, she extended her hand, the crystalline patterns on her palm glowing with new colors that no astrolese had ever displayed before her. "The High Council believes your influence has compromised my logical perfection," she told him. "And what do you believe?" Marcus asked, his hand hovering near hers. "That we are creating a new constellation," Lyra replied, her fingers intertwining with his. Where they touched, light danced between crystal and flesh, silver scars resonating with living patterns. One neither of our civilizations could have charted alone. Beyond the observatory viewport, the binary stars of the astrolese system completed their eternal dance, two fundamentally different celestial bodies, bound together by forces neither could escape, creating in their union a light that illuminated worlds.